This lesson is on using the midpoint formula, and we're going to start by simply looking at what the midpoint formula is, but we won't really understand it until we get into it. So to understand it, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find a series of midpoints between 2 points on one axis. That is, just on a one-dimensional axis. Then, once we've learned how to do that, we'll learn how doing that same process twice will find us the midpoint on a two-axis or a Cartesian plane. Then finally, once we've done that and we've used the midpoint formula, then we'll go back and we'll determine what it is so we can really understand it. So the first thing we're going to do is let's just look at the midpoint formula, ugly as it is. And here's what it is. It says the midpoint is the sum of the x-coordinates, x1 plus x2, over 2, and the sum of the y-coordinates, y1 plus y2, over 2. But if you look at that, it's ugly, it's hard to memorize, it looks like it's difficult to use, so don't memorize it. Instead, let's understand where it comes from. Then you won't have to memorize the formula, you'll be able to use it, and you'll actually be able to derive it and figure it out as you need to. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about, well, what is a midpoint? And a midpoint is the point in the middle of a line segment. And you already know how to do this. If I have a line segment with 2 points, well, the first thing I need to do is I need to count the units between those 2 points. So let's do that. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've gone 6 units in between the points. The next step is to take that number of units and divide it in half, or multiply by a half or divide by 2. So if I take 6 and divide it by 2, I get 3. And the final step is to count by that many from either of the points. I could have done it on the left or the right. I'll just choose on the left. And I'm going to count by 3 points. 1, 2, 3. And so there is my midpoint. I follow this exact same procedure if I have a numbered number line rather than just a blank number line like I have in my first example. So the first step is, instead of counting, I'm going to add the units. So I add the 2 different points, 0 and 6, add them up, I get 6. Next thing I do is I divide by 2, I get 3, and so my midpoint is at 0.3. I can do this exact same thing even if I have negative numbers on the negative side of the number line. So if I have trying to find the midpoint between -10 and -4, step 1 is to add the numbers. -10 plus -4 equals -14. Step 2 is to divide the numbers. So I'm going to divide them by 2, and so I get -7. So my midpoint of -10 and -4 is -7. Can do the same thing if I have only one negative number. So again, if I have -4 and 2, same process as always, add the numbers. In this case it would be -2, divide by 2, I get -1, so my midpoint of -4 and 2 is -1. Can do the same thing if the answer is going to turn into a fraction. So if I'm trying to find my numbers between the midpoint between 2 and 7, step 1 is to add the numbers. So I add them up, I get 9. Step 2 is to divide by 2. So I do, and I get 4.5. So it happens to be a fraction, 4.5. But that's okay, it's still on the number line. The midpoint is right there, right in between 4 and 5, 4.5. Finally, I can do it if I have negative numbers and fractions. So if I'm going to try to find the midpoint between -3 and 2, same process as always. I add up the numbers. -3 plus 2 equals -1. I divide by 2 or multiply by a half, and I get -1/2. So my midpoint is going to be -1/2. Now that I know how to do this on one axis, I'm going to do the exact same thing just twice in coordinate geometry when I'm looking at a Cartesian plane. So I'm going to do it once for the x values, just like they're on one axis, and I'm going to do it once for the y values, just like it's on one axis, and then the value I get for both of those together is going to get me the midpoint. So let's say I was trying to find the midpoint between these 2 points, between point 1 and point 2. Well, the first thing I do is, to make it easy, let's make the x values into red, so we'll turn those red right there. And if I'm just doing it on one dimension across my x-axis, then I just look, and my first point is right along there, that line, and my second point is right along there, that line. And so following the previous process, to find the one in the middle, it would be that line right there in red. So that midline is my midpoint of all my x-axes. If I was just doing it on the x-axis, I would have the values of -4 and 0, and so it's going to be -2. Now I'm going to do the same thing again for the y values. I'll turn them blue so it's easier to see, so let's make those blue. So 0.1, my y value is there. 0.2, my y value is right there. So if I add those up, that's -5 and 3. Add those up, I get -2, then divide by 2, and I get -1. So if I'm just looking at my y-axis, I have those blue points there. And then the intersection of those two midpoints is right there. If I get rid of all these lines, you can see that that purple point, -2, -1, is the midpoint of this line segment. Let's do it now with some actual values. So let's say I have a line segment TR, and it has endpoints T of 0, 5 and R of 2, 1. So let's graph that. And I want to find the midpoint M. So M has both x and a y coordinate, and again we'll make the red ones, x ones red, and the y ones blue just to make it easier to see. So step 1 is to find the midpoint of x. That will be the x coordinate of M. So I take my two numbers, in this case 0 and 2, add them up, divide by 2, and I get 1. I'm going to do the exact same thing with y. So I'm going to take my two y coordinates, in this case 5 and 1, add them up, divide by 2, and I get 3. So my midpoint is 1, 3. But let's do one more step to make sure we got this right, which is, let's do step 3. Let's check to see if we didn't make some silly mistake. Let's check for sanity. So to do that, does it look like this point is in the middle? Let's put it on our graph there. And if I look at that, just looking at it, it's on my line, and it looks like it's about in the middle. So the answer is, yeah, it passes the sanity check. So I know my answer is going to be 1, 3. Now that we know how to do this, let's determine the midpoint formula. There's the ugly formula. So right there, that is my two x points that I've just divided by 2, which is what we just did. And so that's the average of the x coordinates. That gives me my x coordinate of the midpoint. And right there, those are my average of the y coordinates. So that gives me my y coordinate of the midpoint. So this ugly formula at the beginning, hopefully now when we look at it, it makes a lot more sense and we understand where it came from.